I call the Honourable Member Moana Maki.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and this will be the first of many calls on this marine legislation bill, particularly on part 2, which is where unfortunately the government is introducing some very disturbing SOPs, but that will come in due course. Mr. Chair, the overwhelming question on part 1 of this bill has to be, why has it taken so long? Why has it taken so long? New Zealand has not yet ratified the International Convention on Civil Liability for Bunker Oil Pollution Damage 2001, and that fact was driven home to us in a very unfortunate and a very environmentally destructive way with the grounding of the Rena off the coast of Tauranga some years ago. Now, that particular environmental disaster cost New Zealand taxpayers a lot of money, and our ability to recoup that money from the vessel operators or vessel owners was limited by the fact that we had not yet ratified this international convention, which would have lifted the liability cap that was in place in terms of what New Zealand could claim. Because currently, Mr. Chair, we are party to the 1976 convention, but we have not yet ratified the updated convention. And when the Rena disaster happened, of course, the issue of the ratification of this bunker convention was a very hot issue. Labor had moved to put in place legislation that would allow the ratification of this convention by Order in Council, and that work had stalled for whatever reason, and sometimes it takes a huge wake-up call like the Rena to make us realise that we need to apply a bit of pressure, really make this a top priority, and ratify that convention as quickly as possible. Well, I don't think anyone's definition of urgency could meet what has happened since the Rena disaster occurred, since the government indicated that yes, it absolutely was going to ratify that convention. It was going to make sure that that $50 million cost to taxpayers would be mitigated in the future. The scales had fallen from the eyes. These disasters unfortunately do happen, and something needs to be done about it. Well, that was years ago, and here we are in 2013, finally in the committee stages of a bill that will make the changes that will allow us to ratify that convention. And the reason I'm so surprised that it's taken so long is because this is an absolute no-brainer. And I look at the national interest analysis that was produced on the International Convention on Civil Liability for Bunker Oil Pollution Damages, and this was back in 2009, I believe, where they list the advantages and the disadvantages to New Zealand of ratifying this convention. And the advantages are that, firstly, ship owners operating in New Zealand waters and their insurers have a clear responsibility to carry insurance and the certainty of limited liability. Secondly, an insurance certificate scheme already in operation in New Zealand gives transparency to the insurance responsibilities of ship owners and their insurers. Thirdly, that any claims for economic loss or clean-up costs can be made either in New Zealand or in another jurisdiction, and can be made against either the ship owner or the insurer. This arrangement allows more adequate, prompt and effective compensation. It also substantially increases the probability of a successful claim in the event of the ship owner going into receivership. Next, that third parties suffering economic loss because of a release of bunker oil have a simpler and more certain remedy available, something that I'm sure the good people of Tauranga and the Bay of Plenty would have loved to have had in place at the time that their own businesses were facing enormous risk and uncertainty because of the Rena disaster. And lastly, that government and regulatory authorities suffering economic loss or facing clean-up costs because of a release of bunker oil have a simpler and more certain remedy available. So that was the advice given to government about the advantages of entering into this particular convention. So what were the disadvantages? There are no significant disadvantages. So here we have a convention that provides enormous advantages that, with the benefit of hindsight, the people of Tauranga, the businesses of Tauranga, the communities of Tauranga and the rest of the Bay of Plenty that were affected by the Rena disaster would have had a transparent recourse to address their economic loss. the government would have had the liability cap lifted, Mr Chair. Mr Chair.
Moana Maki.
Thank you, Mr Chair. The liability cap for what the government could claim back would have been lifted. The process that would have been in place would have been far simpler. It would have been faster. There would have been requirements on the vessel operators to actually have proper insurance in place. It would have been clear that if that vessel was not flagged in New Zealand, that we could still chase that compensation, not just in New Zealand, but in the courts in other jurisdictions. All these things lead us to ask the question as to why it is taking so long. When there are no significant disadvantages, when we've seen what happens when something goes wrong, and heavy fuel oil is just about the most disgusting kind of oil that you could possibly put into the water. It's very viscous. It's environmentally very toxic. It is nasty, nasty stuff. So we're talking big bickies when it comes to cleaning this up. Really big dollars, and we saw that with the RENA. So it's good that it's finally passing through, but this could have been passed very quickly, I suspect, with the support of all parties across the House. Could have been put in place far sooner rather than dragging it out so that we can have an excuse to have a piece of legislation that we add dreadful SOPs to, restricting the rights of New Zealanders to have a say in consenting processes, because that's what we're going to be doing in this committee part. I know it's in part 2. I'm glad the Minister agrees with my assessment of what's about to happen in part 2. That's in part 2 of the bill, and this is being dragged out so that we can add in these SOPs in the next part of the bill, when in fact this should be going through very, very quickly indeed, Mr Chair. I would have hoped that, I remember going to public meetings in the Bay of Plenty during the 2011 election campaign when the Honourable Dr Nick Smith was the Minister in charge of this particular area, and he promised a packed meeting in Whakatane that everything would be done to ensure that we were not put in this position again. That everything would be done to ensure that it wouldn't be the taxpayers that would be fronting up, that local business owners and communities would have some kind of recourse, that there wouldn't be any kind of out where companies go into receivership or where they're based in other jurisdictions, that we were going to tighten down on this, that yes, this should have been ratified earlier. No one could have foreseen what was going to happen. We've learnt from our mistakes. We've learnt from this experience. We're going to do something about it. And it's been 2 years and nothing has happened. 2 years where this could have happened again. 2 years where the risk to the environment, the risk to our economy, which relies on our natural environment, could have been put in the same situation again. And I look forward to hearing from government members as to why this hasn't been made more of a priority, why this has been delayed in its passage through the House, and why there wasn't more of an effort to look around the House for a cross-party consensus to get this done as quickly as possible, to limit the liability of New Zealand taxpayers when a foreign-owned vessel, whether it be their fault or not, and of course one of the qualities of this international convention is that that's not part of the discussion. If something goes wrong and the oil ends up in the water, then New Zealand taxpayers will be protected regardless of liability on the part of the vessel operator or owner. So I look forward to taking more calls, particularly in the next part, Mr Chair, but I do look forward to an explanation from the government as to why this issue, which in the 2011 election campaign was going to be an issue of overriding importance and urgency, has since gone completely off the boil, has not been progressed at all, has been delayed and slowed while we've passed legislation which is far less important, which has far less urgency than this particular piece of legislation. I look forward to the Minister's explanation on that.
The Honourable Member Gareth Hughes.
Kia ora, Mr Chair. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Kia ora. It's a privilege to rise and take a call on part 1 of the Maritime Legislation Bill in front of the